Meditations on First Philosophy. Folks, this is Descartes' most famous work that you're likely to encounter in a philosophy context. Like I said previously, he actually wrote on a very wide range of subjects. He even wrote a book on physiology. He was sort of interested in the way the human body works. He also wrote works related to physics and things of this nature. He actually spanned a whole lot of what we would call specialized disciplines today. But in a philosophy course, his main works that are typically mentioned or anthologized are his Discourse on Method, which I talked about last time, and his well-known Meditations on First Philosophy. That's the full title. Take a guess what we usually just call it. Meditations. So yeah, if you hear someone calling it Descartes' Meditations, they're talking about the very same thing. Now, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, he is applying that method that we talked about in Discourse on Method. And his ultimate aim is to ground his philosophical system in firm foundations. Now keep in mind, part of his method is also to take absolutely nothing whatsoever for granted. So he will begin by clearing his mind of anything that he presupposes, anything he has learned in the past, anything that perhaps questionable sources may have taught him and so forth. And he is going to contend that he can know absolutely nothing for certain. Now, the very strange thing that he does in his meditations is he will question what? In the first meditation. He will actually question whether or not he has a meaningful rationale for believing in his own existence. And I think I joked about this before. This sounds to some students like some Bill and Ted's type stoner might do. Hope I haven't offended anybody with a stereotype there. You know, after a few joints and, you know, a couple of tall boys or whatever, hey man, how do I know that I really exist? Or how do I know that this hand in front of me is really my hand? Well, this could be fodder for stoners, I don't know. But Descartes had a more pertinent rationale behind it. He was trying to determine if there is absolutely anything that he can that he can know. And remember, when we say know, we don't just mean think I have a good reason to believe. He is talking about to know in what kind of peculiar sense. Starts with a C? Yeah. Descartes is looking for certainty. Because if he's going to build a foundation of knowledge, he is going to have to start out with indisputable truths. Now, the first truth that he is going to uncover, unsurprisingly, will be his own existence. And here is how he gets there. He will first say, well, I take for granted that I am René Descartes, comes from a particular region, and I am sitting here in my dressing gown at my table with quill, and I'm writing. He says, I take all of these things for granted. But how do I know any of this? With a capital K. I only know it. You have to know this word. I only know it a posteriori. This is not good enough for Descartes. Why? A posteriori knowledge means knowledge through the what? Through the senses. Descartes has already said that I cannot fully trust my senses because my senses have deceived me in the past. And besides, even to the extent that most of us trust our senses, we are well aware that they don't give us reality as it really is. Our senses mediate what I believe is external reality. So even even if we trust our senses to some extent, we can't have certainty about it. Descartes is seeking certainty that he exists. And unsurprisingly, and I'm slightly cutting to the chase here, he is going to have to find arguments that rely on a priori principles. This is just another fancy damn Latin phrase, meaning something like an idea that is, one way it's described as the same thing as being innate, and by innate we mean something like inborn. However, I like to make the distinction between innate ideas and a priori, because Descartes is getting at something that's actually kind of different. A priori knowledge is knowledge that is known through the clear light of reason alone. Now, some of the things that I know through the clear light of reason alone are mathematical principles. If you understand what the concept 2 is and the concept 3, and what the concept or operation of addition is, it's not just an opinion that 2 and 3 equals 5. It is true. Now, Descartes wanted to know if he could, in the same sense, know that he exists for certain. Now, in order to test whether or not he could know for certain that his mind exists, I should say that he exists, what he is going to do is subject it to the most radical of doubt. Remember, that's the method of doubt we've already discussed. Now, he uses 2 hypotheses in order to test it. The first one is Descartes' famous dream hypothesis. And I'm going to cut to the chase a little bit here too, for time's sake. Can I know with a capital K that I am not dreaming right now? Right answer. I cannot know that I'm not dreaming right now. I could be dreaming. I have had dreams that are as vivid as this right now. I have had dreams that are as vivid as so-called waking life, as we call it. I have had dreams that I've been in front of classrooms talking just like this. I mean, I've had car accidents in my dreams. I've beaten up people. Yeah, imagine that. I've beaten up people in my dreams. I have done illicit things in my dreams. I won't go into any detail there. But the fact is, when I'm dreaming, it feels what? It feels real. Every bit as real as this feels. So how do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? Well, Descartes' answer is you don't. But even if you are dreaming right now, guess what dreaming implies? To dream implies a dreamer. In other words, if there is a dream taking place, there must be an I that is having a dream. Now, Descartes is not satisfied, because remember, this method of doubt is supposed to take it to its radical extreme. Next, he postulates what in his doubt of his own existence? He postulates an evil genius. This evil genius is supposed to be like his conception of God's evil twin. Remember how God is perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly loving? Well, he hypothesized this evil genius as perfect in all those ways, except he is a deceiver. And he is a perfectly skilled deceiver. The question is, could this deceiver deceive me about my existence? Descartes' answer to that is no. He could deceive me about what I am. He could deceive me about where I am. He could deceive me to the point where I might think I'm eating my favorite meal, but instead I could be eating, a bowl full of slugs. In other words, he could radically, give me different perceptions that are in fact real, if the evil genius is this powerfully diabolical. He says, but there's one thing the evil genius could never, ever do. And I'll give you the punchline. Even if deceived, that still implies what? Even if I'm perpetually being deceived, there's one thing the evil genius could never deceive me about. I am. To be deceived still implies one who is being deceived. Descartes, at this point, will be able to make that famous pronouncement. Cogito ergo sum. You've all heard this translated how in the past?
I think, therefore I am.
There you go. I think, therefore I am. To be more precise, this might cover what Descartes intended a little bit better. I exist as a thing that thinks. Because Descartes is very clear about this. Through his dream hypothesis and his evil genius hypothesis, he has not proven that he exists as a body. Because he knows about his body through his what? Through his faulty senses. His senses that he cannot fully trust at this point. The only thing that he has established is that he exists as a mind, a thinking thing. Now, I want to say this now, just to make it clear how Descartes conceived of his mind. He defines this a little further later on in his meditations. But Descartes will contend that his true self is his mind. Because the mind is the part of me that directs this other part of me. He also believed, as his part of the Christian tradition did, that God is something like a divine mind. As a consequence, the superior part of us isn't our body, it's our mind. And you might recall that the early church fathers like St. Augustine believed that it was the fleshly part of us that led us into temptation. This whole demonization of the body is kind of built into our Western tradition. The mind is the better thing. The body is this fleshly machine, according to Descartes, that at some point we may be able to what? That is, if our faith is correct. At some point, we will leave this fleshly machine behind. And we will exist in pure mind, aka pure soul or spirit. So yeah, Descartes conceived of the mind and the body as separate and distinct substances. And in the first meditation, he is only able to establish the existence of his own mind. And folks, the title of his second meditation, and I'll admit I'm going into more detail than the text does on this, because I think it's important to have the individual pieces. In his second meditation, this is actually the title of it. The mind, that it is better known than the body. In the second meditation, Descartes realizes that he is making a leap to even claim that he can know that he has a body. And that is because, as many of you properly answered a few minutes ago, his only evidence that his body exists is through his senses. A priori knowledge. A priori knowledge cannot get us to certainty. So he still can't be certain that his body even exists at this point. Now, his contention that the mind is better known than the body is fairly simple. Because the body is understood a posteriori, the mind is known how? The mind is known a priori. As a matter of fact, it is the basic truth according to Descartes. I know my mind more directly than I know my body. Because the fact that I'm thinking, speaking, communicating is dependent upon this thing that I call my mind, not my body. Now, I want to go a little bit further here. There is a very powerful piece in here. It's an illustration. You might hear it called Descartes' soft piece of wax or his soft ball of wax illustration. I confess that the first time I read it as an undergraduate, sitting in a similar seat to you, I had no idea what the Hades was going on. And it wasn't because I was daft. It was because if you don't know the method to Descartes' madness, it does sound like he smoked a joint and was Bill and Tedding it or something like that. Yeah, admittedly. But what Descartes does is he says, here I am sitting again at my table. You know, I've got my comfy chair and all this stuff. He says, I have in my hand a soft piece of wax that has been recently taken from the honeycomb. It's got a particular texture. It's got a particular shape. It's an extended thing. In other words, it takes up space. It has an aroma. That aroma from being freshly taken from the honeycomb. Descartes doesn't say this, but I will. But I suppose if I were to lick it, it would also have a taste. I know about physical things, as we call them. I know them through their... I speak about them through their properties. And I know about their properties a posteriori. In other words, I have to still have doubts about them at this point. Now suppose, and this is what Descartes talks about, he's got a fireplace heating the room. He sets down his piece of wax and he leaves the room to do something else, and he comes back. And lo and behold, my soft piece of wax seems to have gone. Because when I come back, I no longer see those same properties anymore. I see a puddle. I no longer sense that aroma. It is no longer a solid but malleable thing. He says if I were going off of my senses alone, what thing couldn't I say? I couldn't say that my soft piece of wax had melted, but it's still the same thing. Because my senses merely give me these perceptions. Without this, without reason, I could not draw those inferences. This is why Descartes will argue not only for the primacy of the mind, but he will argue for the primacy of reason as the vehicle to getting us to truth, not the senses. The senses could not have led us to the conclusion that it melted. It is rationality that enables us to draw that conclusion. Now, most of you say, well, of course it melted. and it's the same piece of wax. I know it is because it's in the same place. Well, how is it that you learn concepts like object permanence? That is a concept that we reason to. Know what I'm talking about? We reason to it. In other words, if it was just our senses alone, and by the way, at this point in time, thinkers who talked about things like perception thought of our perception as something like a recording device. We record the external world through our senses, and it etches, metaphorically speaking, onto our minds. Now you notice if all I had were my senses, all I would have are these recordings of perceptions. I could draw no what about them? I could draw no other substantive conclusions about them. This is the illustration that Descartes uses to demonstrate the primacy of reason over the senses for getting us to the truth. Now, at the end of the second meditation, Descartes is well aware of the fact that if he were to stop right here, the only things that he could know would be the existence of his own mind. And that knowledge cannot get me where? It can't get me to a knowledge of anything else. So he's going to have to find a way not only to draw the conclusion that at least I sometimes must be able to trust my senses to an extent. And I also have to be able to illustrate, or I should say, to conclude, that there is more that exists in this thing that we call the universe than just my mind. And if you think that's a crazy idea, keep in mind that the only thing that I really experience is my inner space. Because where do all of my experiences occur? They don't occur out there. My experiences take place in what we call my inner space, in my mind. I experience patches of blue that I might be, if I'm perceiving a patch of blue, that blueness is experienced in my mind. The taste of my morning coffee is a mental event. The taste of hot sauce on a Sunday afternoon or whatever is an experience that takes place in the mind. My experience of you people, yeah, I'm going off here. My experience of you people is also a mental event for me. For all I know, perhaps the only thing that actually exists is in fact my mind. I can't know for sure. Notice I keep on having to preface it, for sure. I can't know for sure that other minds exist. I can't even be sure that an external world exists. This is why in Meditation 3, Descartes has already formulated a solution to this. Descartes will prove the existence of God, not primarily as a good Catholic, but this is my phrase for it. God turns out for Descartes to be a powerful I hope you like my colorful metaphor. God will be a sort of epistemic glue for Descartes. God will be a necessary component of his theory of knowledge because, in fact, he will use God to tie a whole lot of things together. Now, admittedly, his argument for the existence of God doesn't satisfy too many people. But what Descartes does is he reasons this way. If the God that he believes in, remember his God is this? God is a being that is infinitely perfect. Now you'll recall that this perfect being has what kind of characteristics? We define this in St. Thomas Aquinas unit. God's omnipotent, omniscient, and I've also said that this God is omnibenevolent. Now, if this God is powerful but infinitely good, what would God not intentionally do to me? Thank you, yeah. Such a God would not intentionally or knowingly deceive me. Would a loving God give me senses that were utter pieces of garbage? His answer to that is no. A loving God would give me senses that were useful in some sense, as long as I first learn to use them properly and exercise restraint in my assumptions that I draw from my senses. Would God give me senses that give me this idea that an external world exists, when in fact one doesn't? Would God give me senses that tell me that the world is made up of what? Material substance, if it weren't made up of material substance? His answer to all those questions is a resounding no. This is why he concludes that if God does in fact exist, that is the God that he believes in, that he can give limited trust to his senses, he can articulate that an external world must in fact exist, that he must have a body, and that not only his mind exists, but other minds must exist. So he reasons that if he can establish clearly and distinctly that God does exist, a whole lot of other things end up falling into place for him. Now, Descartes is not allowed, and I hope most of you saw this on the quiz, guess what kind of arguments for the existence of God are not viable for Descartes? I'll write this on the board.